president of U.S. programs, specializes in issues related to U.S. social and demographic trends, and in particular issues related to children and families. And you've been working for a long time on the, what's the name of the program?
The Kids Count Project.
Kids Count, which many of you have probably heard of. You know, this has been an ongoing initiative since 1990. So
yep.
That's a very important part of what he does. His research has been cited in all the major media. He's actually, Dr. Mather has a Ph.D. in sociology and demography from our own University of Maryland. Go Terps. And today he's going to talk about something that we discussed a little bit yesterday, which is the issue of demographics. How is the population changing? And we can talk about how those changes affect retirement and the retirement cohort and how that is changing. So, Mark Mather, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
Okay. Is it okay if I sit here? I think people can see okay. I think we can keep this fairly informal, so we have an hour and 15 minutes, I think. I don't have that much material, so feel free to interrupt or ask questions, or if anybody has any comments. As Linda mentioned, I work for the Population Reference Bureau. We're actually right up the road, so I just had to take the south exit this morning instead of the north exit at DuPont Circle. PRB, for those who, it sounds like you haven't worked with PRB before, we are the oldest population-related organization in the United States outside of the Census Bureau. So we started right around the time of the stock market crash in 1929. Actually, we were affiliated at that time. We don't like to talk about it too much, but there was a eugenics movement at the time, and PRB was got started, unfortunately, around that time in terms of controlling the population. But over time, we've evolved. We're now focused much more on, we have a large international programs department that does a lot of work on reproductive health issues, and then I work for the much smaller U.S. programs department, where, as Linda mentioned, we do a lot of work on the well-being of children and families. I do work with journalists, maybe not as much as I used to. There used to be more journalists who are more dedicated, just focusing on population issues, and it seems like it's not as often the case these days. But we're all census data experts, so if anybody has any questions about Census Bureau data, we are good people to call. We always can put our hands are on those numbers every day, and we're happy to analyze any data for you. So I'm going to talk today about population aging in the United States, and this presentation is really split into two different parts. So the first part is really focused on why population aging matters. And I think, as all of you know, the population in the United States is getting older. So this chart shows you the number of people ages 65 plus in the U.S. back to 1900, all the way through 2050. And you can see it's right around 2010. That's when the first baby boomers started to reach age 65. That's when we start to see this really steep increase in the aging population. So in 2010, we had about 40 million people total who were 65 and older. That number is expected to more than double by 2050. We're expected to have up to 84 million people 65 and older by 2050. Not only a sharp increase in ages 65 to 84, but also in the 85 and older population. So how many people have seen population pyramids before? A few people. Well, these are very popular among demographers. This is a population pyramid for the United States in 1970. So each bar here represents a different age group. On the left-hand side we have men, and then on the right-hand side we have women. And then here's the large baby boom cohort. Back in 1970, they were they were school age or college age at the time. And you can see in 1970 we did have really a true population pyramid with a large population of kids at the bottom, and then it tends to get narrower at the top. looking forward to 2010, you can see that the pyramid has shifted quite a bit. Baby boomers are now in that prime working age, or getting close to retirement age, around ages 40 to 64. And you can see this little bump down here at the bottom. These are the echo boomers. So all of those, that big baby boom cohort, they had lots of kids. They produced this large echo boom population, which many of you may have heard. That led to the record school enrollments that we had recently. That echo boom, by the way, it tends to just last one generation, because baby boomers did not have as many kids as their parents' generation. During the baby boom, which lasted from 1946 to 1964, there were, I think at the peak there were about 3.7 births per woman. Obviously, the baby boom generation themselves, they had much lower fertility. Actually, in the 1970s, the total fertility rate, which is the average number of births per woman, dropped down to its record low of about 1.7 births per woman. So the echo boom is large relative to other cohorts, but it's expected to diminish because fertility rates have dropped so much compared to what we experienced during the baby boom. So here is what the pyramid looks like in 2030, and you can see it's no longer so much a pyramid as a population rectangle. The baby boomers are now well into the older age categories, ages 65 to 84. Here's that slight bulge here, the echo boomers, the baby boomers' kids, and this is just expected to continue in the future, where we have a rectangularization of the U.S. population over time.
Does that assume that mortality remains unchanged, mortality rates?
I think that the Census Bureau assumes that there will be modest improvements in terms of life expectancy over time, but those, like I said, those are fairly modest improvements. So there's not expected to be any major changes in mortality. The population projections are really difficult, and a lot of it hinges on what happens with immigration in the United States. So the Census Bureau will have, when they do their projections, they'll have a low series, a middle series, and a high series based primarily on what they're projecting will happen with immigration. So the numbers that I'm showing here for 2030 assume pretty much steady migration, assuming that the levels remain where they are today. Projecting it forward, this is what the population will look like. Oops. Looking at this another way, this shows you the percent of the population that's ages under 18 in the blue bars. The primary working age is 18 to 64. Those are the orange bars. And then ages 65 and older are the green bars there. And so you can see this steady increase from 1970 to 2030 in the proportion of the population 65 and older. After 2030, the population continues to increase at those older ages, but at a much slower rate. So all the baby boomers have pretty much already entered those older age groups by 2030. And we'll still see some modest increases, but nothing like we're going to see in the next 20 years. Yeah.
Between 2030 and 2050, it seems like that's the time when the echo boomers would be getting into the green bar. But
Yeah.
it only shows an increase of 1%
Yeah.
in the higher. So are they, just as a percentage, they're going to be that small? I'm assuming there's no assumption that, what we're hearing from the health folks, our kids are not going to live as long as we did. That doesn't factor in, does it?
No, it's really, I think they're pretty much projecting improvements in life expectancy over time. There are some issues in terms of, rising obesity rates and that type of thing, but it's not going to be a significant impact. And yeah.
I don't want to throw you off from your presentation here, but I'm just curious. Do you know why there are so many more millennials than there are Gen Xers? Why? Do you know what?
why we have such a large number of millennials.
versus Gen Xers.
Well, I think that we are seeing the effect of immigration there. Past levels of immigration have created a pretty large base of young people in this country. Obviously, and I'll get into that a little bit later.
Okay.
So relative to the baby boomers, we've had much smaller cohorts follow them, including the Gen Xers. But we're seeing echo boomers and immigration fuel a large population of young people in the country. So it's a combination of factors, I think. So as I showed you, about 20% of the population is expected to be 65 or older by 2030. But if you look at the local level, there's obviously lots of counties that have already passed that threshold. So this is a county level map. Those darker areas, the darker shades of orange, are those where the population is already at least 20% 65 or older. So not surprisingly, you see large numbers in Florida, parts of the Southwest, but then there's also this large number of counties in the Midwest, stretching from sort of the Dakotas down through Kansas, parts of Texas. So what's going on there? Whereas in Florida, a lot of it's obviously retirement. It's a retirement destination. People are still moving there for retirement, and that's really what's driving most of those gains in Florida. In the Midwest, it's really more linked to out-migration of young people. So there's lots of young people moving and not enough young families moving in to offset those people who are leaving. So that's what demographers call aging in place. And a lot of these counties in the central part of the country have been losing population for many decades now, and population aging has really accelerated in those areas. The question a lot of people have is, we have this large number of baby boomers, many of whom are still working, they're living in big metropolitan areas, they're going to be they're starting to reach retirement age, and the question is, what are they going to do once they exit the labor force? So many predicted that they would be moving to more affordable, less crowded rural areas around the country, and as far as we can tell, that hasn't happened yet. So we're still kind of waiting to see, as they exit the labor force, are they going to be, creating maybe a rural rebound in some of these communities that have been losing population. But I think partly because of the recession, people are still staying close to metropolitan areas. Many are still working, and we have not yet seen any major impact from that retirement wave. Yeah.
I'm from Kansas. And familiar, I've seen firsthand, my wife's hometown, as a matter of fact, is one of these sort of, for lack of a better word, victims of outmigration. And do you have it, hopefully this doesn't get too far afield, but do you have any sense that, in a town like hers, where the services, the basic services, because that outmigration, those basic services, grocery stores, post office, bank, they've kind of all gone, right?
Yeah.
And now you've got literally an empty Main Street and houses around that. Do you have any sense, because those services have left these rural communities because of outmigration, will that impact whether boomers decide to, because they're going to need those services, right? And if they're not there, is that going to sort of prevent them from repopulating the rural resurgence? Yeah,
no, I think that is a big issue, and when an area is experiencing population loss, it tends to be cyclical. There tends to be a downward spiral. So you lose population, and then you lose services, you lose the tax base, infrastructure, and so it does become harder to attract new people. It gets harder to attract new businesses because you don't have the consumers. And so there tends to be a downward spiral until there's some kind of something can jumpstart the economy to start creating jobs again. And that's happened in North Dakota, as you all know, with the oil boom, lots of people flocking there. But there's lots of other parts of the country where there's really not much. It's hard to see how they're going to turn things around. And natural amenities is one way that places are doing that. They're attracting retirees because they've got lakes and mountains and golf courses and the types of communities where people want to live. But if you've got a place in the desert and a bad climate and it's cold winters, that can be a real challenge to attract people back.
Is the break point that you determined here, 20% of the population, significant, or is that just sort of a random choice? Or
That's
is
not
that the break
necessarily.
point for-
Yeah, it's not really significant, except if you look at 20% is right now. If you look at Florida, for example, that state is close to 20%,
Okay.
65 and older. So, and that's where we expect to be in by 2030. The whole population is expected to be about 20%. So that's the only reason we use that cutoff.
I had a question. I'm from Michigan, and it's sort of funny how it just cuts at the top. You have a lot of returns, living in some retirement areas, but isn't that sort of strange too? Or, because the further north you go, the colder it is, I guess is what I'm trying to get.
Right.
It's
They want to be
pretty
closer to
cold.
the Canadian drugs.
Well, there are some retirement areas up there, right? And I would think there's also not a whole lot of economic opportunities for younger families. So it might be a combination of some retirees moving there and the fact that there's not a lot of young families moving in.
I have a question. I know in Florida, we actually have whole zip codes of towns built on retirement, like the villages, and, Pala. Do you find that with the other counties where basically the whole industry is just retirees?
I don't think there's probably not too many areas like that outside of Florida and parts of the Southwest.
Because that's like Disney World for retirees.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's
It's
sort
its
of a.
own world, and it's just very.
I think Florida's kind of unique in that sense. There might be some new areas springing up also in the Carolinas that are like that. There's some parts of the Carolinas I think are becoming the new Florida for retirees. Florida's lost a little bit of its luster, but yeah, those are some interesting demographics in those places. But that's not to say that, where you've got a large number of retirees, they are going to need services. So there's got to be young, often new immigrants living nearby who are going to be around to provide those services. If they're not in the town, they're going to be nearby because of that population growth.
Is there a percentage level of older Americans that if it gets over this percentage, it tends to lead to economic decline? Is there a line that you would aim for, develop for?
Not necessarily. It really depends in part on the mix of older people that you have there. So if you've got young old, 65 to 74, lots of young aged residents who have a fair amount of money and retirement income, that could actually be an economic boom for an area, and areas want to attract those types of residents. If you've got mostly the older old who have already gone through their savings, they're in that 75 plus age group, that might be more of an issue in terms of a drain on the.
Are demographers starting to, to extent that lump everyone over 65 as one group, but as we increasingly see, it's not one group. It's all-
Exactly. Yeah, it really is a big difference. 65 to 74 is often what we consider the younger age, younger old, and beyond that is the old. So one way to kind of gauge the significance of these changes is to look at the elderly support ratio. That's the number of people we call working age, that's ages 18 to 64, per people ages 65 and older. That number has dropped dramatically over the past century. So back in 1900, we had about 14 people who were working age relative to the population 65 plus. That has dropped down all the way below 5 in 2012, and it's expected to drop further down to less than 3 in 2030. And I will come back to this later to talk about why that elderly support ratio may not be as relevant as it used to be. But here's a county map showing these darker areas are those where there are fewer than 3.5 workers for every person 65 and older. So it's a very similar looking map, but you can see a little bit more in that darker areas in parts of Appalachia, western Pennsylvania, parts of Illinois. So again, this is it just shows you how widespread this phenomenon has become. And I wanted to mention my grandmother, who she provides kind of a classic example here. She lived in Pennsylvania all of her life, and when she retired, probably when she was in her early 60s, she moved down to Florida. She lived in Winter Haven for about 20 years and was part of that big migration to Florida. When she was in her 80s, she moved back to Pennsylvania. Her health started to decline, so she wanted to live close to my parents, and she was probably about 85 at the time. And then she went on to live to be 107, and she had gone through all of her savings probably by the time she was 100, but my mother lived next door and was able to help her through all those years. But I think we're going to be seeing this type of phenomenon much more and more. When she had reached about 105, I looked up the numbers in the census to see how rare it was for someone to live that long. And it was actually not as rare as I expected. There were, according to the 2010 census, about 4,000 people nationwide who had reached who were aged 105 or older. And even just in Pennsylvania, there were about 150 people who were at least her age or older. So with all these baby boomers reaching retirement age, we're going to see more and more of these stories about people who are over age 100. And she lived in her own house right until the day she died at 107. So it's really.
So maybe you can settle a debate we now have.
Sure.
I had heard in one story I did that the cohort of people 100 and over isn't really growing that much, that it's growing in all these other older areas.
Right.
And then Mark had heard that wasn't true for a story he
Right.
did. So let's turn to you.
That story did come out at the time of the 2010 census because the 2010 census numbers showed very slow growth in centenarians back from 2000 to 2010. So the numbers came in lower than anyone thought. But as far as we can tell, that's not related so much to the 2010 census numbers as it is to an overcount of the elderly in 2000. So it was those numbers based on the 2000 census that were probably inflated because of the way the census was conducted. They may have double counted some of those folks back in 2000. I think it was that's the number that's more likely to be, because that number was very high, higher than anybody expected.
But it's growing.
It's
year
still
by
growing,
year.
year by year.
I mean, we have a lot more now than we had in 1966.
Yeah.
That figure.
Definitely. Yeah.
Do you know by how much? I mean, is it growing as rapidly as all the other ones?
That's a good question. I couldn't tell you if it's much faster than 65 to 74, for example, but it should be increasing every year. Life expectancy is still increasing, especially among men. So men are now catching up to women at those older ages, and we don't see so much of an imbalance that we used to see. I think at age 85, if you make it to age 85, men are just a year behind women in terms of life expectancy at age 85. So
Are men
men catching up to women because women are doing worse?
I think that there's a little bit of both going on. So women might be doing a little bit worse because they started having these stressful jobs, and I think that's part of the story. But it's also men are doing better. There's a lot more advances in medical technologies and healthcare, and so I think it's a combination.
What about over 105? Are you seeing people go much beyond that?
Once you get to 105, the numbers do drop off significantly. So there are about 50,000 centenarians, but as I said, there's only about 4,000 people who have made it to 105. So once you get to those very upper ages, it does tend to drop off quite a bit.
Do you know how they were overcounted in 2000? How did they overcount elderly?
I think it may be related to they had some issues in overcounts, duplicate counts in 2000, and they tried to address that through some changes with the census form in 2010. I can't say 100% that that's what's causing it, but I suspect that it's duplicate counting. I mean, I can't think of any other scenario where they could lead to such an inflated number. So that
the report that the number of centennials on record stayed the same was actually not true. It was caused by a statistical glitch.
I think so.
Is it?
Yeah. So the implications of all this, there obviously are implications for federal programs such as Social Security and Medicare. This shows you the share of gross domestic product that is for Social Security and Medicare, it was only at about 4% of GDP back in 1970, and projections show that it's going to be up to 12% of GDP by 2050. So that's why this is always being addressed in Congress. Lots of concerns about the potential cost of aging populations. Something that's not discussed too much, but another potential implication of for all these baby boomers reaching retirement age, there are some major changes underway in terms of family structure in the United States. So, and I have three of them up here. One is we've had, since the early 1960s, we've had rising rates of divorce in the United States. So it's estimated that up to half of women, baby boomers, are going to will have been divorced by the time they reach age 65. So many of these older Americans are going to be living alone. They won't have a spouse available to provide care and support in old age. A second change that's important is what's happening at the younger ages in terms of marriage. So among younger adults, we have a lot fewer young adults who are getting married. And they're either postponing marriage, or they're living together, cohabiting as an alternative to marriage. And the issue there is that these cohabiting relationships tend to be a lot less stable than marriages. So kids will start out in what looks like a stable relationship when they're born, and then 5 years later, that couple has split up, and this increase in divorce rates and cohabitation, the decline in marriage, all of this is creating a lot more complex family arrangements in the United States, including lots of blended families where there's a woman who has a daughter. She used to have a boyfriend. The boyfriend moved out, and now she's living with someone else who has their own daughter. So we have these blended families and these very complex living arrangements for kids. The reason this is important for population aging is because it's not clear if the older population is going to have as the same kind of kinship network that they've had in the past to rely on for support. So the type of support that my grandmother had living next door to my mom, that's going to, I think, be less common because of all of these changes that we're seeing right now in terms of family structure.
You also see, talking to people here, you know, it seems that internal migration is commonplace in America.
That's right.
People now tend to live their children, you know, in all directions.
Right, and some of the baby boomers, we do expect them to move closer to where their kids are. So that's one of the migration patterns that we expect to see in the next 2 decades. Is baby boomers will be moving to be close to where their kids are living, because a lot of those kids have moved all over the place for jobs. But it is more complicated because of all that internal migration. And if you want more information, I'm not an expert on the family structure information, but there's a guy named Andrew Cherlin at Johns Hopkins who has written a whole book on this topic, and he talks to journalists a lot about this issue. He wrote a book called The Marriage Go Round, which kind of it describes all of this churning that's going on in families and the implications for caregiving.
Can you spell his last name?
Cherlin, Cherlin, at Johns Hopkins. So this gives you shows you a time trend of how how the family structure has changed since 1940, and the dark blue bars. You probably can't read this at the bottom, but those dark blue bars at the bottom are married couples with kids as a percent of all households, and then the lighter orange bars are married couples without kids. So even as back in 1960. We're talking about 75% of all households were married couple households. So that's the Leave It to Beaver model, and that has changed dramatically over time. If you look at 2010, you can see that less than half of all households in the U.S. are now these married couple households, either with or without kids. Part of that is just due to population aging. So we have a lot more people who are living alone at older ages. But a lot of it's what's happening in terms of marriage at the younger ages as well. So there are really big shifts going on right now in terms of family structure.
So when you say that more than half of women, baby boomers, will have been divorced, does that mean they're single?
They may not be single. They may be remarried. They may be living with a boyfriend, but they have been divorced at some point.
So what about the men? I mean,
it's similar trends for men.
So I mean, are more women ending up single than men?
I think that is probably true to some extent because of the differential in life expectancy, but that women are more likely to be single and not have a spouse present compared to men at older ages. But the trends are very similar for both groups.
Jane, I did a story on silver divorces, and at least in Miami, anecdotally, when I talked to like divorce lawyers and other people, said that for various reasons, women have tended not to remarry as often. First, because their potential pool of partners was limited, while men can date, I think somebody told me, up and down the scale of ages.
Right.
But the other thing was the support groups that women have, so their emotional support group was among other women. I don't know if that's true or not, but that was what some of the divorce lawyers,
Right.
and even like family therapists would tell me.
Okay. So this is again family structure, but in this case I'm showing you for the most recent data. These are the differences by age group in terms of living arrangements, family structure. So what I want you to look at here is that middle 25 to 44-year-olds. You can see the wide diversity of living arrangements for those people kind of in prime working ages, with 38% are married couples with kids, 12% married couples without kids, 19% single parents with children, And then we have a fair number who are in other family arrangements. That might be a child living with their aunt or uncle, for example. People living alone. So just this wide range of different family types, which is a result of all that complexity in marriage and cohabitation. If you look at 65 and older, you can see that the large number of people who are living alone in those age groups. So 44% of those 65 and older were living alone in 2010.
Do you have that broken down by race or ethnicity or any other?
We do in a report that we wrote back in 2011. I think the report is called Aging in the United States. It's on our website, and we break this down for different racial ethnic groups, so you could see that. But I probably couldn't describe that off the top of my head. Except to say, if you're white, you're much more likely to be living alone compared with Latino families, which tend to have much bigger kinship networks. This is another area that I'm not an expert in terms of what's happening in terms of health status. But in general, what we're seeing in the older population is that disability rates are increasing. So it's sort of this paradox that they're living longer, but they're living longer with these chronic disabilities. And obesity may be part of why we're seeing those trends. But just since 2000, we've seen a rise in disability rates. In many cases, people are living with multiple chronic health issues. And the concern is that this is going to lead to issues down the road in terms of provision of health care, create too much of a demand on nursing homes and other long-term care facilities. Not to mention Medicare, Medicaid.
So, I mean, so they were declining for like 15 years and then they started to increase? And do you think most of that has to do with obesity?
Not necessarily mostly due to obesity, but that seems to be, I mean, obesity rates have increased quite a lot just in the past couple of decades, so that could be playing into
65
that.
and older, obesity rates have
Yes.
increased quite a lot?
So baby boomers today are, compared to their parents' generation, they're much more likely to be overweight and have these chronic health issues. And a part of it does seem to be related to...
Some analysts have argued that it's easier to get on disability now, but I don't know how that applies to the over 65. They just think it's an artifact, just like food stamps. They made it much easier to get on food stamps.
Right.
Now we got a lot more people on food stamps.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if that is playing a role. And disability, and just in terms of measuring disability, there's so much controversy in terms of how do we measure it, and the way we measure it keeps changing over time, so it's very complex. It's difficult to study and look at these long-term trends because we don't have great data over time, and there's a lot of competing theories about what's happening.
But this is from disability on government programs? Or what's the data here?
These are among Medicare enrollees, but I couldn't tell you off the top of my head how they're exactly measuring disability. It's typically in terms of activity limitations is how they measure
So
it.
can you have been 50 and just have continued being disabled and got to live longer where you might have died?
Yes, right. So that's part of it, that people are now living longer with chronic diseases because of improvements in healthcare and technology and prescription drugs. So whereas in 20 years ago, you might not have made it to 65, now people are living much longer with these chronic conditions. So to conclude the end of part one of this presentation, yes, population aging matters. It matters for the federal government, and especially for lots of states and local areas where we see these high proportions of people 65 plus. And the issue is that the way the current law is defined, it's going to be hard to sustain that by 2050 because of all of the entitlement programs that we have in place for the elderly. It's going to potentially have an impact on the healthcare system, and we could see potential shortages of caregivers, which is going to put greater demands on these healthcare systems because the kinship network is not going to be there to help.
Do you factor in, you carry on assuming that 65 will be retirement age, even in 30 years' time, 35 years' time? It probably won't be, will it?
It won't be for
So
me.
that'll impact.
No, I think they've already increased it for me to 67 in terms of when I can collect full benefits. So I think they've already factored in that that's going to be increasing 60, 67, 70.
People in the workforce at 70 plus,
Yeah,
it's going to minimize the impacts that you're concerned about won't be as
exactly. Which brings me to part 2 of the presentation. So I've talked about all of these reasons why aging is important, but if you compare the United States with lots of other developed countries, we're really not, they're really much farther along than we are on this aging curve. So here's the United States compared to many other countries in Europe. I've also put Japan in here because Japan is the oldest country in the world. Right now, about 24% of the population in Japan is 65 and older. That could increase up to 40% by 2050. The United States is all the way down here with Russia, and by 2050, even Russia's going to have a much older age structure than the U.S. So relative to other places, we're really in much better shape in terms of we have a much younger population than lots of these other countries for reasons that I'll get into in a minute. Here is the population pyramid projected for Japan in 2030. You can see we really have an inverted pyramid in this case, with a very large number of, especially women, ages 85 plus by 2030. So what's happening in Japan is they've had a low fertility rate for quite some time, and they don't have much immigration, so that's just a recipe for population decline and population aging. And things could change. I think they may need to make things change in order to fill jobs in the labor force, but this is where they're headed.
I read a Wire story. I can't tell you if it was Reuters or Bloomberg, but I thought I read here something, in the past few months about how younger Japanese in their 20s are sort of choosing a lifestyle of abstinence, and not even getting. I mean,
Why
not
would they
even.
do that?
Well,
So I would assume that would be even more problematic here. Or has that been factored into this?
Well, it would be in terms of people not getting married and not having kids. Most children are still born to married couples, so if they're going to college, going to work, and not getting married until they're 35, that's all going to feed into this decline in fertility, and I think that probably is part of the equation. Yeah, and part of it's the high cost of living, and people obviously want to do well in their careers, and it's happening a lot in Europe as well. Somebody else have something?
Can I ask you, can we get our hands on these
Yes.
slides later?
I'm happy to. You're welcome to share these
We
with.
will be posting these slides on our website and on Scrib, and we'll make sure it's available to you. And we're hopeful that each day's slides will be posted by the following day. Is that
Yes,
accurate?
that is accurate, as well as the audio recording of this entire
Oh,
session.
great.
How long does that stay up? Just for
Forever.
So it can just go.
Yeah.
Thank you.
don't the Japanese also have a big centenarian group? Because I saw a movie that happened to have been produced at the University of Miami called The Silver Mirror.
Yeah.
They went to Italy and they went to Japan and
Yes.
studied why these people lived.
Yeah, so that they do have also one of the longest life expectancies in the world, which is part of why this is accelerating the way it is compared to Russia, which has a fairly low life expectancy. So that's also a factor here.
It's the youngest country in the world.
The youngest country in the world, it would be in sub-Saharan Africa, but I couldn't tell you which country that would be exactly. But my colleagues back at
Which
PRB
is not
would say.
necessarily good, everybody's
Right.
dying too young.
That's right.
I read that the life expectancy in Sierra Leone for a male was 28.
Wow.
Yeah.
Kenya's population is, I think, the fastest growing, and it's supposed to double in the next, by 2050.
Yeah.
But that is because of fear that kids won't live long enough, so people just
Right.
keep having more babies.
Yeah. And HIV has really taken its toll in parts of sub-Saharan Africa too, so that's causing slightly higher mortality than they would have otherwise. But related to the slides, I'm happy to share not only the slides, but if anybody needs any data points, I'm not territorial about this stuff, so I'm happy to give you any of the underlying Excel data. So another way to look at this is there's so much focus in Congress on those baby boomers hitting retirement age, but kids are going to outnumber the elderly until around 2050. So as Linda said, I do all this work on the Kids Count project. I work with the Casey Foundation, and in my view, there's too much attention paid to these short-term issues with solvency of Medicare, Social Security, whereas we have to take a longer-term view, which is we have all these kids who we're going to depend on to pay into these systems. So we still have a very young country. That's the point here, and it's going to stay that way for quite some time.
Have these population projections for age cohorts been adjusted for migration? In other words, if migration rates decline or increase, what happens to the age pyramid?
Yes, you can look at those. Again, these are based on the median projections, which assumes pretty much level immigration levels for what we have right now going into the future. If those were to drop, we would potentially see much more rapid population aging. And if they increased, we could see we'd have more young folks for a longer period of time.
So we could actually see that purple graph going up, or the purple line going up, or?
You could, yeah. Yeah, immigration is, you're not only bringing a lot of young people into the country, but all those young people are going to have their own families. So that creates a lot of population momentum, and it creates a younger.
So just so I understand, the assumptions behind what you've been showing us are that the current rate of immigration remains constant.
Yes, that's right.
Does that, just out of curiosity, when we talk about immigration, are we talking about both legal and illegal immigration?
That's right. To the best that they can capture that,
Sure.
they're trying to do
He
that.
says that the rate of net migration or immigration last year was 0. So this is the trend up to 2010 or something?
That is, yeah, I saw that report, and I don't think this isn't assuming zero net immigration into the future, but it's probably based on some recent time series that they're then moving forward. So, the recession has had an effect on recent immigration trends. They're not using the recession trajectory to look forward, but rather what's happened over a slightly longer period. So we talked a little bit about race, ethnicity. So this, I'm going to, and I'll talk about why this matters in a minute, but we have rapid changes taking place in racial ethnic composition in the United States. So back in 1980, about 80% of the population was non-Hispanic white. That's dropped down to 63% white today, and by 2030, just over half of the U.S. population is expected to be white, whereas we have this rapid growth in the number of Latinos. So I think everybody's familiar with these trends. But what's been interesting is that most of this is being driven by what's happening among young people. So this is the same graph for those who are under age 18. So probably within the next 8 years, for those under age 18, less than half of kids are going to be non-Hispanic white. So we'll pass this what they call a majority-minority threshold for kids. So kids are at the forefront of all of these racial ethnic changes. And what this means is that we have this interesting situation in the United States where all of these baby boomers we have this big cohort of baby boomers, they're hitting retirement age, and most of them are white. And you can contrast that with this fairly large population of kids who's increasingly a member of some racial ethnic group other than white. So each bar in this graph shows you the percent of the population that is a minority or not non-Hispanic white. Back in 1980, you can see for different age groups, there wasn't a whole lot of differences across different generations. So about 26% of those under age 20 were minority, compared with 21% of those 20 to 39, slightly lower for those 40 to 59, down to 12% for those 60 and older. By the time we get to 2010, there's this much larger gap between different generations. So I call this the new generation gap in the United States, where older folks much more likely to be white, younger folks much more likely to be minority, especially Latino or Asian or multiracial. And this chart is a little bit hard to explain, but because I've got two different y-axes here, but this is what's behind that chart I just showed you, that growing gap between generations. The axis on the left-hand side is the average number of births per woman. That's the total fertility rate from 1911 through 2011. So that's 100 years of fertility. And you can see where it drops here during the Great Depression, around the time of the Depression. And then this is the baby boom, where the fertility rate went way up, increasing over 3.5 births per woman, and then dropped sharply in the early 1970s to close to where it is today. We're still at a fairly low level. On the right-hand axis, this is the percent of the population that's foreign-born in the U.S. Those are the orange blocks. And so we have this kind of inverse relationship that occurred during this unusual period of the baby boom, where fertility was going up rapidly, but because of quotas that the U.S. population had in terms of immigrants, the percent foreign-born was dropping rapidly. So that's what's creating this unique situation we're in today, with and then the percent foreign-born skyrocketed. So 1965 was a significant year because it marked the end of the baby boom. So all these non-Hispanic white babies were being born, and suddenly the baby boom ended. And that's when the foreign-born percent started to take off because of relaxation of immigration policies. So that's where we are today, with this large population of white baby boomers, with smaller cohorts behind them. And then immigration at the same time has created this very diverse population of young people. That's kind of a unique point in our demographic history. Any questions about that one? Another way to look at this is in terms of the population pyramids just for non-Hispanic whites, which, as you can see, looks a lot like the overall U.S. pyramid for 2030. So whites are sort of already there. They're aging rapidly. They've got a pyramid that's not really a pyramid anymore, compared with the Latino population, which looks much more like, they've got that big base of young people, which has been fueled by immigration. 25% of kids are the children of immigrants, and that's why the U.S.'s population is relatively young relative to places like Japan and Germany and parts of Europe.
Did you say 25% of all children are children of immigrants?
Yes, that's right. So at least one of their parents was born outside of the United States.
And a child is 18 or under?
Less than 18, 0 to 17, yeah. Just a couple of other relevant trends here. One is that older Americans are working more. So all those baby boomers are much more likely to stay in the labor force compared with their parents' generation. And this is why that elderly support ratio that I showed you earlier is not as relevant as it used to be, because a lot of these older Americans are still working. They don't need any support. In fact, what we're seeing in terms of labor force participation is that the whole distribution is shifting up the age scale. So younger people, they're not going to work as early. They're staying in college. A lot of them can't find jobs. A lot of them are still, they might not be living with their parents, but they're still financially obligated. They're depending on their parents to support them. So in a lot of cases, these support networks are really going down to people ages 25 to 34 rather than these young people supporting the older people. And this is happening not just for, it's happening for all the groups, 65 to 69-year-olds and people who are 70 plus among both men and women.
So this is both full-time?
This is everybody, so it's anybody who's in the labor force. And many of these folks are just working part-time. They're not working full-time.
Do you know, I mean, obviously we had the financial crisis in 2008 and the Great Recession.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know if those events and just boomers not prepared for retirement are the primary drivers of that?
That's factoring into this, but it's not the primary driver because we saw this increase long before the recession hit.
Okay. Yeah.
And a lot of people in their 50s and 60s, they lost their jobs during the recession, and for those folks, it was often harder to get back in the labor force. So a lot of people did drop out just in the past few years. You can see a little bit of a leveling off maybe, but it looks like it didn't have a major impact. Yeah.
Well, we heard yesterday that the average retirement age is still about 59. Is that going about what you're hearing?
I haven't heard I'm not sure about that, but that sounds plausible. There's a lot of folks who do retire early. They start to take benefits at 62.
Do we know what's driving that then? If it's not, as your graph clearly illustrates, if it's not the recession and retirement, I mean, do we know why they're staying in the workforce longer? Is it because they're healthier?
They're healthier. I think that's a big part of it.
Okay.
And many of the folks who are in the labor force might have chronic conditions, chronic disabilities, but because of new medical technologies, they're able to keep working, whereas their parents were not able to do that.
So there's probably a number of factors at play.
Yeah.
Why so many older Americans are still working. It's not.
I would think at least a part of it, for some people, would have to be, my kids aren't settled. My kids have finished college, but they don't have a job, or they're underemployed, and I need to keep working because I need to keep helping them. I mean, at least part of it.
Or your parents.
Yeah.
I suppose a lot of 70-year-olds have their parents alive to worry about.
They're also better educated. So this shows you back to 1940, the percent of people 55 and older who have at least 4 years of college, and that's just gone up steadily over time for both men and women.
Better educated people work a lot longer.
Yes, they're healthier.
If you're a stonemason, you're not going to work until you're 80.
Yes, that's
If you're
right.
a lawyer, you can't.
Right.
Yeah.
So just the mix of different jobs that are available in the service economy and the knowledge economy now compared with 20, 30 years ago has changed. So people, I think, are they're able to keep working compared with a factory job. And people who are better educated, they're healthier, they have longer life expectancy. So that could also be a factor.
I have to say, maybe it's because I live in a sort of bubble here in Washington, but that the overall percentage of people who've completed college at this age is this low. I mean, it's 25 and 32 or 33%. I guess when you're looking at the population as a whole, that makes sense. But just, here, I'm sure it's vastly.
Yeah, DC is a little sort of unique in that sense with the.
Well, plus you look at who your friends and your family are, and you're kind of all going in that same kind of group. You don't hang around with people.
We really do live in bubbles, I guess.
Yeah.
Do you have a projection for a year that women are gonna, the lines are going to meet? Because it seems like in the
Yes.
younger age groups they have.
It already has for younger age groups. So you'd expect that to cross over for older age groups as well. I'm not sure when that'll happen, but women already outnumber men on college campuses, and among certain younger age groups, I think they already have higher percent of women who are college educated. So that's changing. So to conclude part two, the answer is no. Population aging doesn't matter because the U.S. is still relatively young. This aging that we're seeing is selective. It's affecting some groups, but not others. You see it dramatically among non-Hispanic whites, but not Latinos, which is our fastest growing group in the U.S. And the fact that baby boomers can cope a lot better, I think, than their parents' generation in terms of population aging. They can stay in the labor force longer, they're healthier, living longer, they're better educated.
So what you're saying is there aren't really as many stories out there as there are.
Well, there's multiple stories.
No, but then if the boomers are staying longer, what happens to all the young people who are
Yes.
move up through the ranks?
Mm-hmm.
They've got I mean, there's companies that there's forced retirement at a certain age, and that opens the avenues, but in others, you're
Yeah.
sitting waiting for somebody to retire.
So when you say it doesn't really matter, you're talking in terms of those scenarios about a lack of available nursing care, or it doesn't matter in terms of what?
Well, obviously it does matter. There's two
No, I
stories
know,
here.
I mean,
But so when I say that it doesn't matter, it's not. I think that it does matter in terms of the healthcare system. But if you compare where we are in terms of the healthcare system
Compared
here
to Japan,
compared to
it doesn't
Japan
matter.
or some other
It's
countries,
not as bad.
it doesn't look as bad.
Right.
Yeah, and
But the burden on Social Security
Yeah.
and the
That's
financial,
still there.
the financial readiness for anybody to retire. I mean, if it's selective, but I don't know. It doesn't seem to answer the question whether we're going to have some sort of, I don't know, if it's going to be a financial crisis or whatever, as
Mhm.
people don't have enough money to retire.
Right.
I'm just curious as to what happens after 2050 when all the baby boomers die. Is it going to right the system once we're all out of here?
Yeah. That's a good question. That's really it's really far in the future.
Speak for all of us.
I mean, there's nothing like the baby boomer cohort that's coming up through the age distribution after them. So I think it could make things a little bit easier in terms of not having such a big shock to the economy, and it's just kind of disrupted everything that we're seeing. And
But I thought millennials were even bigger and coming right behind.
it's, I mean, it is a big cohort, but it's nothing compared to what we had with the baby boom
In terms of percentage.
in terms of numbers relative to other
Yeah.
groups. I mean, there's a lot of them, but the population as a whole is growing,
Right.
and relative to other groups, they're not that.
So I would assume in the history of the United States, baby boomers is the largest generation period. Is that correct?
It's always been, hasn't it?
Sounds right. Yeah.
Have you studied how long the kinship, the propensity for a robust kinship network lasts in the Latino culture after they get here? I mean, does it go away? Because fertility goes down rapidly. I mean, just the kids of immigrants, they're just like the rest of us. They're having
Mhm.
2 kids or less. But what about the kinship network and grandpa lives in the house and all that stuff?
Yeah, I'm not an expert in that area either, but I know that in terms of lots of characteristics, first generation does tend to look like they'll tend to retain a lot of those relationships, but once you get past second, third generation, they're going to look just like everyone else in the U.S. So I think they do tend to lose some of those ties over time, and you might be able to see that in some of the older immigrant communities, like if you look at the Puerto Rico community in New York, and you could make some of those comparisons between different subpopulations of Latino immigrants to see what is the household living arrangements for those groups versus newer immigrant groups.
But then I think there's still a higher rate of young Latino women getting pregnant earlier, so or teen pregnancy, which would kind of
Is there?
I think so. I'm pretty sure that it's quite high in the Latino
I don't know.
population, still in the teen population, which would suggest that you would need more kinship care probably to.
Yeah, I don't know. I know that the single, I think Link is white, but that's teen
Teen pregnancy?
pregnancies, but that would
Oh,
be
maybe.
because they're larger.
Uh,
Percentage-wise, I
right,
don't
right.
know.
In
Yeah.
terms of, maybe that's what I'm referring to, is
Yeah.
in terms of the per capita.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do have one final slide here. The implications, I think, from my perspective, the biggest demographic change that's taking place is these changes in racial ethnic diversity, and this juxtaposition of the older boomers versus these new immigrant groups. That's where all of this action that I'm talking about is taking place. It's in those two groups. And sometimes it's taking place in the same communities. So if you go to parts of the Southwest, you can see these older retiree communities alongside new immigrant communities, which are all these folks in their 20s and 30s, mostly Latino, living alongside these older white folks. So the question is, how is this going to play out in the future on a national scale? Are we going to have enough? Is the future labor force going to have the necessary skills and training to be able to support economic growth and support all of these aging baby boomers? And that's, I think, where policy focus needs to be more on what's happening with the young families, many of whom are struggling, and maybe a little less on the short-term issues that we're facing with baby boomers.
Well, what do you mean about the policy issues? What are you referring to?
Well, there's just so much attention paid to Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and what's going to happen next year, and there's very little attention on all of these young families and kids who have high poverty rates, who look very different from the policymakers who are making all these decisions about older white folks. So all this, as the population diversity also moves up through the age distribution, I think a lot of these policies will change. But right now we have a white Congress who's making all these decisions about mostly older white folks, whereas the future of the population is what's happening with these younger families who are much more racially, ethnically diverse and look very different.
That mosaic that you put up early on with the counties that have 20% or more above 65, do you have a feel for how that breaks out racially? Is it more white? Those counties tend to be more white than the overall average, or
The counties that have 20%.
more than 20% people over. You had one early slide up that showed counties where there's 1/5 of the counties have more 20% or more people over 65.
Oh, right. Those would be mostly, Florida might be a little bit different, but
Right.
certainly in all those Midwestern aging counties, those are mostly white communities. Some of them have started to fill in a bit in terms of new immigrants coming in for factories that are opening up in the Midwest and that type of thing, but it's mostly whites.
From your viewpoint, what do you think that is being overlooked when you're talking about the younger children? When you're focusing so much on Social Security and Medicare, at what extent?
Well, I'm mostly interested in inequality, so I do a lot of work on how kids are doing in especially families where the parents don't have a college degree. I think a lot of the differences that we're seeing among young families, and economically, it's all related to education. So the families where there's a two-parent family and both have a college degree, those kids are doing great, and they're getting good jobs. But increasingly, you've got to have that college degree to make things work. And what we're seeing in terms of all those changes in family structure, all those unstable households, those are much more likely to be the families that don't go to college. They're much less likely to get married. They're much more likely to have kids outside of marriage. So right now, about 40% of all births in the United States occur outside of marriage, and that's much more likely to happen if the parents didn't go to college. So those are the kids that are most at risk. They have much higher poverty rates. They're much more likely to drop out of high school, become teen parents themselves.
How is that different than when, immigration, when Germans and Italians and Irish were coming in without college degrees and poverty and all that? How is it different today than it was then?
Well, back then, a college degree didn't mean what it meant today. Very few people were getting college degrees. So for those earlier immigrant groups, there were a lot of opportunities in factories and where you didn't need to go to college to get a decent job. A lot of them did face a lot of the same issues that current waves of immigration are facing in terms of backlash against Polish immigrants and German immigrants and that type of thing. But I think it was a little bit easier in that there were better paying jobs available these days. If you don't have a college degree, it's hard to.
But isn't part of the issues that we're seeing with the economy right now and jobs is that there aren't enough people to do the manufacturing jobs and such like that, versus people who are sitting around well educated without jobs or underemployed.
Or the manufacturing job.
There's just not there's not that many good jobs available. Certainly not in manufacturing. where that sector, it might have picked up a little bit in recent years, but over the long term, the number of jobs has dropped sharply, whereas service jobs is where most of the growth has been. So those jobs just don't pay very well, and they're making minimum wage, and they're relying a lot on EITC and other government programs to get by.
And there's no upward mobility.
Right.
So unlike you had with the previous immigrant groups where there was, even if you were in the solid working class, which is not something you can aspire to for a lot of these newer immigrants.
Right. A lot of issues raised during this last session. Mark, thank you so much. Really appreciate
Thank
your
you.
having been here.
Thank you.
Now you